He thought forcing her onto that stage would make the room laugh for a few cheap seconds. But before the night was over, the same people mocking her would be too stunned to speak. Snow drifted slowly across downtown Chicago as black luxury sedans lined up outside the Grand Carlisle Hotel, their headlights glowing against the marble entrance where photographers snapped pictures of wealthy donors stepping into the annual Winter Arts Charity Gala. Men in tailored tuxedos adjusted diamond cufflinks, while women in sparkling gowns floated beneath towering crystal chandeliers worth more than most American homes. Waiters carried trays of champagne through a ballroom filled with politicians, investors, celebrities, and people who believed elegance gave them the right to look down on everyone else. And near the far entrance, standing quietly beneath a gold-framed portrait of the hotel founder, was a woman nobody seemed to want there. Claire Whitmore wore a faded gray coat that looked at least 10 years old, her blonde hair tied back in a loose bun, her hands wrapped carefully around a small leather envelope. She wasn't glamorous. She wasn't loud. And in a room obsessed with status, that alone made her invisible. Or worse, one guest glanced at her shoes and smirked before whispering something that made his wife laugh behind her wine glass. Another assumed she was hotel staff and handed her an empty champagne flute without even making eye contact. Claire simply accepted the embarrassment in silence, lowering her eyes with the kind of calm that only comes from years of being underestimated. Across the ballroom, Ethan Carlisle noticed her almost immediately. Tall, polished, and carrying himself like a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered, Ethan was the 38-year-old owner of the Carlisle Hotel Group and the unofficial king of Chicago's elite social scene. People laughed louder when he spoke. They stood straighter when he approached. And tonight, with a charity event honoring classical music patrons, Ethan was enjoying every second of the attention orbiting around him. Then he saw Claire standing alone near the grand piano. Who invited her? He muttered, swirling bourbon in a crystal glass. His friends turned toward Claire, scanning her from head to toe with amused expressions. Maybe she's lost, one woman joked. Ethan smirked. Or maybe she wandered in looking for the employee break room. The group laughed softly, not cruel enough to sound ugly, just polished enough to sound acceptable among rich people. Claire heard every word, but she didn't react. Her fingers tightened around the envelope instead. On the stage at the center of the ballroom sat a gleaming black Steinway grand piano beneath soft golden lights, prepared for a live orchestra performance later that evening. Claire stared at it for a moment too long. Ethan noticed. And suddenly, the arrogance in his eyes sharpened into entertainment. He crossed the ballroom slowly, expensive leather shoes echoing against the marble floor as conversations lowered around him. "Ma'am," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes, "you seem very interested in the piano." Claire looked up politely. "I'm actually waiting for someone." "Really?" Ethan asked. "Well, while you're here, maybe you can help us." Several nearby guests turned toward them, already sensing amusement coming. Claire remained still. Ethan gestured dramatically toward the piano. "If you're going to stand next to the entertainment all night," he said, loud enough for surrounding tables to hear, "the least you could do is entertain us." Laughter rippled through the ballroom. Claire's face flushed slightly beneath the chandelier light, but she said nothing. Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal. "Come on," he said. "Sing something for us." Another wave of laughter followed. Somewhere near the back of the room, a young waitress named Mia Bennett stopped carrying her tray and stared at Claire with growing discomfort. Because unlike everyone else in that ballroom, Mia noticed something strange. Claire Whitmore did not look afraid. She looked heartbroken. And sometimes, those are the people the world should never underestimate. The room kept laughing. But destiny had already entered the ballroom, and before the night ended, every person there would remember the exact moment they underestimated the quiet woman beside the piano. The laughter did not explode all at once. It spread slowly through the ballroom like expensive perfume, subtle enough to sound civilized, but sharp enough to wound. Claire Whitmore stood beside the grand piano with the leather envelope still pressed against her chest, while dozens of strangers watched her as if she had accidentally wandered onto the wrong movie set. Ethan Carlisle lifted his bourbon glass slightly toward the nearby orchestra members. "Come on," he said with a polished grin. "Everybody here supports the arts tonight. It would be rude not to participate." A few guests chuckled louder this time. Someone near the back whispered, "This should be interesting." Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, breathing carefully as the golden chandelier light reflected softly across the piano keys beside her. She looked as though she was deciding whether humiliation was worth enduring just to finish the reason she came there. Ethan noticed her hesitation and mistook it for weakness. Men like Ethan often did. "What is the matter?" he asked. "Stage fright." More laughter followed. A woman in an emerald dress pulled out her phone and quietly opened the camera app. Others copied her. Soon glowing screens floated throughout the ballroom, like tiny windows waiting for a disaster to happen. Claire glanced toward the ballroom entrance as if considering leaving, but before she could move, a sharp voice suddenly cut through the air behind her. "Mia, table 7 is still waiting for champagne." A middle-aged event manager snapped impatiently at the young waitress balancing a silver tray near the stage. Mia Bennett apologized quickly, nearly dropping 2 glasses as several guests rolled their eyes at her. "Maybe hire competent staff next year," one man muttered loudly enough for her to hear. Mia's face turned red with embarrassment. Claire watched the exchange silently. Something shifted in her expression then. Not anger. Recognition. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what it feels like to stand in a room where people mistake dignity for weakness. Ethan stepped closer to the piano. "Tell you what," he said smoothly. "I will make it easy for you." He turned toward the orchestra conductor seated nearby. "Play something simple." The conductor looked uncomfortable, but nodded politely. A few soft piano notes echoed through the ballroom. Ethan gestured dramatically toward Claire like a television host introducing a late-night joke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "our surprise guest performer." The crowd applauded with thin amusement. Claire remained motionless. The room waited. Somewhere outside, wind rattled softly against the tall hotel windows while snow continued falling across Michigan Avenue. Then Claire finally spoke, her voice calm and almost too quiet for the ballroom to hear clearly. "I did not come here to entertain anyone." Ethan smiled immediately. "That is obvious." Another ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. But Claire did not react this time. She slowly placed the leather envelope on top of the piano and removed her old gray coat, folding it carefully over one arm. Mia stared at her from across the room, noticing something nobody else did. Claire's posture had changed. The nervous woman standing alone near the entrance was gone. In her place stood someone composed, someone trained, someone carrying a stillness too deep to be accidental. Ethan sensed it too, though he could not explain why the confidence suddenly unsettled him. "Well," he said with forced charm, "if you are refusing, I suppose we should all move on." But before he could turn away, Claire gently touched the edge of the piano and looked toward the orchestra conductor. "What piece were you planning to perform tonight?" she asked softly. The elderly conductor blinked in surprise. "Puccini," he answered after a pause. Claire nodded once. Small, controlled, familiar. And for the first time all evening, the conductor looked at her not with pity, but with curiosity. The ballroom slowly quieted. Because sometimes before a storm changes the entire sky, the world grows silent first. The silence hanging over the ballroom felt strange now, no longer amused but uncertain, as though the room itself could sense something shifting beneath the polished surface of the evening. "Ethan." Carlyle maintained his confident smile, but it had tightened slightly around the edges. He did not like losing control of a room, and somehow the quiet woman beside the piano had interrupted the rhythm of his performance without even raising her voice. The elderly orchestra conductor studied Claire carefully from his chair. Up close, he noticed details others ignored. The way her fingers rested naturally near the piano keys, the posture in her shoulders, the calmness in her breathing. These were not the movements of someone unfamiliar with music. "You know Puccini?" he asked gently. Claire nodded once. "My mother loved Madame Butterfly," she said softly. Her voice carried no attempt to impress anyone, and somehow that made several nearby guests pay closer attention than before. Ethan laughed lightly, reclaiming the spotlight before the atmosphere could drift away from him. "Well then," he announced, turning toward the crowd, "perhaps we are about to witness the Carlyle Gala debut of Chicago's hidden opera star." A few people laughed again, though not as confidently as before. The orchestra members exchanged uncertain glances. Claire lowered her eyes toward the piano for a brief moment, and memories she had spent years burying began rising quietly beneath the surface. Years earlier, long before silence became her shield, Claire Whitmore had stood beneath very different lights. At 23 years old, she had trained at the New England Conservatory in Boston, where instructors once described her voice as unforgettable. Critics called her performances emotionally rare. One newspaper even wrote that her voice did not simply fill concert halls. It reached into them. But talent alone had never shaped Claire's life. While classmates chased careers across Europe and New York, Claire spent her nights inside hospital rooms beside her mother Eleanor, whose health declined slowly over nearly a decade. Opera houses were replaced by waiting rooms. Standing ovations became pharmacy receipts and sleepless nights. Eventually, Claire stopped auditioning altogether. The music world moved on without her. New stars replaced old headlines. And over time, the woman once expected to become one of America's brightest classical performers faded into quiet anonymity. Yet even after all those years, music never truly left her. Some mornings, before opening the small public library where she worked on the north side of Chicago, Claire would sit alone in her apartment with a cup of coffee growing cold beside the window and softly sing old Italian melodies while snow fell outside. No audience, no applause, just memory. Back in the ballroom, Ethan leaned casually against the piano. "You still have not told us your name," he said. Claire hesitated briefly before answering. "Claire Whitmore." The conductor's eyes narrowed slightly. Something about the name brushed against an old memory he could not fully place. Across the room, guests continued whispering among themselves while several phones remained lifted, waiting for awkwardness to begin. But the longer Claire stood there, the less she resembled entertainment and the more she resembled someone carrying a story nobody else in the room understood. Mia quietly stepped closer with her tray, pretending to collect empty glasses just so she could hear better. Claire gently touched the leather envelope resting atop the piano. Inside was a handwritten letter from her late mother addressed to Maestro Leonard Hale, the conductor seated before her now. Eleanor Whitmore had once asked Claire to deliver it personally if she ever found the courage to return to music again. Tonight had not been planned. Fate rarely announced itself politely. Ethan checked his watch dramatically. "Well," he said with growing impatience, "either sing something or let the professionals continue." Several guests nodded in agreement. The pressure in the room tightened once more. But Claire no longer looked trapped by it. She looked like someone standing at the edge of a life she thought had already ended. And somewhere deep inside the ballroom, beyond the crystal chandeliers and expensive laughter, destiny waited quietly beside the piano. The ballroom waited with the kind of silence that only wealthy people knew how to create, a silence polished by judgment and expectation. Crystal glasses rested untouched on white linen tables, while nearly every eye remained fixed on Claire Whitmore beside the grand piano. Ethan Carlyle could feel the room slipping away from him, and his pride refused to allow it. He smiled again, smoother this time, masking irritation beneath charm refined by years of controlling powerful people. "All right," he said loudly, clapping once as though directing a rehearsal. "If we are doing this, let us at least make it interesting." Several guests leaned forward with renewed curiosity. Ethan turned toward Maestro Leonard Hale and spread one hand dramatically. "Play something difficult," he said. "No nursery rhymes. Let us see whether our mysterious guest really belongs near a piano." A few men laughed quietly into their drinks. The conductor hesitated. "Mr. Carlyle," he said carefully, "perhaps this is unnecessary." "On the contrary," Ethan replied, "this entire evening is about celebrating artistic excellence." His eyes shifted toward Claire. "And excellence should survive pressure, should it not?" The words sounded elegant, but the cruelty beneath them settled coldly through the ballroom. Ethan was not offering Claire a chance. He was building a stage for failure. Guests sensed it immediately. Phones rose higher. A woman whispered, "This is going to be painful." Another man smirked, "She will panic before the first verse." Claire remained still beside the piano while the orchestra members quietly prepared their sheet music. The overhead chandeliers cast soft gold across the polished black surface of the Steinway, reflecting Claire's calm face back at her like a memory from another life. Ethan walked slowly around the stage area, enjoying the attention again. "What should we choose?" he asked the conductor casually. "Something ambitious." Leonard Hale studied Claire one last time, still unable to shake the strange familiarity surrounding her name. Finally, he sighed softly and nodded toward the orchestra pianist. Nessendorma, he said. Several guests reacted immediately. Even those unfamiliar with opera recognized the difficulty of the piece. It demanded emotional control, range, and immense vocal power. Ethan's smile widened. Perfect. He wanted the room to witness collapse, not merely discomfort. Excellent choice, he said smoothly. Miss Whitmore, if you survive this one, perhaps we can book you next year. More laughter followed, though thinner now, less certain than before. Claire slowly looked across the ballroom. Wealthy strangers stared back at her with curiosity sharpened by superiority. Some expected disaster. Others simply wanted entertainment to break the boredom of another luxury fundraiser. None of them understood the weight carried inside the quiet woman standing before them. Mia remained frozen near the service station at the edge of the room, clutching an empty silver tray against her chest. She could not explain why her heart suddenly hurt watching Claire stand there alone beneath all those judgmental eyes. It felt wrong, like watching someone precious being pushed toward humiliation for sport. Ethan checked his watch again impatiently. Well, he asked. The audience is waiting. Claire inhaled slowly, not nervously, deliberately, the kind of breath shaped by years of disciplined training. Maestro Hale noticed immediately. His expression changed. Around them, the orchestra adjusted quietly beneath the dim ballroom lights while snow continued drifting outside the tall glass windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Then Claire reached for the piano lightly with one hand and spoke so softly the room almost missed it. My mother used to say that people reveal themselves most clearly when they think someone beneath them cannot answer back. Ethan chuckled dismissively. And what does that have to do with tonight? Claire lifted her eyes toward him for the first time since entering the ballroom. Calm, steady, unafraid. You are about to find out. The room fell still again. Even the waitstaff stopped moving. Somewhere near the back, a champagne glass trembled faintly against silver as the orchestra prepared to begin. And without realizing it, the people who came expecting a performance had already stepped into something far more dangerous. A moment powerful enough to expose every soul in the room. For one long second, nobody in the ballroom moved. The orchestra waited with their instruments poised beneath the chandelier light, while Claire Whitmore stood beside the grand piano with one hand resting lightly against the polished black surface. Ethan Carlyle folded his arms confidently, certain the silence meant fear had finally reached her. Around the room, wealthy guests exchanged amused glances and adjusted their phones to capture what they expected would become an embarrassing memory before dessert was served. Then Maestro Leonard Hale slowly raised his hand. The orchestra obeyed instantly. Soft strings emerged first, low and haunting, drifting through the ballroom like winter wine slipping beneath a closed door. The piano followed carefully behind, elegant and restrained. Claire closed her eyes for the briefest moment. Not dramatically, not theatrically, like someone stepping into a memory she once loved too much to survive losing it. The room watched her breathe in. One slow breath. Calm, measured, trained. And then she sang. The first note entered the ballroom so powerfully and so perfectly controlled that the reaction was immediate. A woman near the front stopped lifting her wine glass halfway to her lips. One of the orchestra violinists froze in visible shock. Across the room, a businessman lowered his phone without realizing it. The sound did not merely fill the ballroom. It transformed it. Claire's voice rose through the air with warmth and depth that seemed impossible from someone the crowd had dismissed only moments earlier. Every note carried extraordinary control, but it was the emotion beneath the music that struck hardest. There was sorrow inside it. Grace, loneliness, strength. The kind of voice shaped not by fame, but by surviving heartbreak quietly. Ethan's smile vanished almost instantly. He stared at Claire in disbelief as the performance continued building through the enormous room. The mocking energy that once floated across the ballroom disappeared completely. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered. Even the servers stopped moving between tables. The only sound left in the Grand Carlisle Hotel was Claire Whitmore's voice rising beneath the chandeliers like something sacred. Mia felt tears gathering in her eyes before she even understood why. She had never listened to opera in her life, but suddenly that did not matter. Claire was no longer singing in Italian to wealthy strangers. Somehow she was singing directly into every hidden wound people carried inside themselves. A man seated near the stage slowly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes in silence. Another guest placed her hand against her chest, as if steadying her heartbeat. Near the orchestra, Maestro Hale stared at Claire with growing astonishment, his expression shifting from curiosity into something deeper. Recognition. He knew that phrasing, that emotional control, that impossible purity in the upper register. Memory flickered across his face like lightning. Ethan looked around the ballroom nervously now, searching for someone still amused enough to reassure him this moment remained under his control. But the room had abandoned him completely. Earlier, those same guests had laughed because they believed Claire was beneath them. Now they sat motionless beneath her voice, unable to look away. Claire opened her eyes during the next crescendo, and for the first time all evening, she appeared entirely unafraid. The years of silence, sacrifice, and invisibility seemed to dissolve inside the music itself. She was not performing for approval anymore. She was reclaiming something the world convinced her she had lost forever. Snow continued falling outside the massive hotel windows, while downtown Chicago glowed cold and distant beyond the glass. Inside, nobody touched their drinks. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody even breathed normally. Because in less than 60 seconds, the quiet woman they mocked beside the piano had transformed the entire ballroom into a room full of humbled strangers. And standing closest to the stage, Ethan Carlisle finally began to understand the terrible mistake he had made. Claire's voice climbed higher through the ballroom with breathtaking control, carrying emotion so raw and human that it no longer felt like a performance. It felt like truth itself had stepped into the Grand Carlisle Hotel and demanded every person in the room stop pretending. The orchestra followed her carefully now, no longer leading the music but surrendering to it. Maestro Leonard Hale watched her with widening eyes, his fingers trembling faintly against the conductor's stand as memory after memory returned to him. 10 years earlier, he had once sat in a packed concert hall in Boston listening to a young soprano whose voice left seasoned musicians speechless. Critics had predicted greatness. Audiences had risen to their feet before her final note even ended. Then suddenly, she vanished. No farewell interview. No scandal. No explanation. Just silence. And now she stood before him again, wearing a worn gray dress in a hotel ballroom, where people had mistaken her for hired staff. Claire reached the emotional center of the piece, and something inside the room broke open with her. Her voice carried grief too deep for performance alone. Every sacrifice she made for her mother. Every dream buried quietly while the rest of the world moved forward without her. Every lonely morning inside her tiny apartment above the bookstore where she sang only to the cold Chicago sunrise because nobody else remembered who she used to be. It all lived inside the music now. A woman seated near the front quietly began crying into a linen napkin. One older man closed his eyes completely, as if listening hurt too much and healed too much at the same time. Even the bartenders behind the marble counter had stopped working. Nobody wanted to interrupt the moment. Ethan Carlisle stood near the stage frozen in complete disbelief. Earlier that evening he had enjoyed turning Claire into a joke because humiliation entertained powerful people when they believed there would be no consequences. But this was no longer entertainment. This was exposure. Every arrogant word he spoke now echoed silently back at him through the stunned faces surrounding him. One of his business partners slowly stepped away from him without realizing it. Another guest glanced toward Ethan with visible disappointment instead of admiration. The balance of power inside the ballroom had shifted completely. Claire continued singing, and the higher her voice rose, the smaller Ethan seemed beneath it. Mia pressed one trembling hand against her mouth as tears rolled freely down her cheeks. She had spent years serving wealthy people who rarely remembered her name, listening politely while guests treated kindness like weakness. Yet watching Claire stand beneath those chandeliers without anger, without revenge, and still command the entire room through pure dignity felt almost sacred. Near the orchestra, Maestro Hale finally whispered the thought that had haunted him since the performance began. "It cannot be," he breathed softly. One violinist looked toward him in confusion. Hale stared at Claire with disbelief written across his face. "Claire Whitmore," he whispered again, this time louder. The name spread quietly through nearby musicians first, then to guests seated closest to the stage. Reactions changed instantly. A silver-haired donor gasped softly. A woman near the piano lowered her phone in shock. "The Claire Whitmore?" someone whispered. "She disappeared years ago." Ethan heard the murmurs spreading and felt his stomach tighten. He turned toward the crowd, searching for the laughter he controlled so easily earlier that evening. But the laughter was gone forever. In its place stood awe, respect, shame. Claire reached the final sustained note of the aria, and the sound filled every corner of the ballroom with impossible beauty. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead while snow drifted beyond the windows like silent applause from the city itself. Then the note ended. Not abruptly, gently, perfectly. And afterward, the silence inside the Grand Carlisle Hotel became heavier than any applause could have been. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because for the first time all night, every person in that ballroom understood the same painful truth at once. The quiet woman they mocked was the most extraordinary person in the room. The silence after Claire Whitmore's final note did not feel empty. It felt sacred. The kind of silence that arrives only when people suddenly realize they have witnessed something unforgettable. Crystal chandeliers shimmered softly above the ballroom, while snow continued drifting past the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago. But inside the Grand Carlisle Hotel, nobody moved. Nobody dared to interrupt the moment. Claire stood quietly beside the piano, breathing gently as the last vibration of music disappeared into the enormous room. Her eyes lowered toward the polished floor, calm and steady, as if she had never wanted applause in the first place. Then somewhere near the orchestra section, a chair scraped sharply against marble. Maestro Leonard Hale stood up so abruptly that several guests turned toward him in surprise. The 80-year-old conductor stared at Claire with visible emotion gathering in his eyes. For a moment, he looked less like one of the most respected figures in classical music and more like a man confronting a ghost from his past. "Claire Whitmore," he said aloud, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. This time the entire room heard it. Conversations that had almost begun instantly died again. Ethan Carlisle stiffened beside the stage. Leonard Hale slowly stepped forward, never taking his eyes off Claire. "I knew it," he whispered. "I knew that voice could not belong to anyone else." A wave of murmurs spread rapidly through the guests. Some looked confused. Others suddenly looked shocked. One older donor near the front table leaned toward his wife with wide eyes. "Claire Whitmore," he repeated softly. "The soprano from Boston." Another guest gasped quietly. "She performed at Carnegie Hall years ago." "She disappeared after her mother became ill," someone else added. "People said she walked away from everything." The atmosphere inside the ballroom changed completely. Earlier, guests had looked at Claire with amusement. Now they looked at her with disbelief, curiosity, and growing shame. Several people slowly lowered their phones, embarrassed by the recordings they had taken expecting failure instead of brilliance. Ethan tried forcing a smile back onto his face, but it no longer fit naturally. The confidence that once filled his posture had started collapsing beneath the weight of public realization. Claire glanced gently toward Maestro Hale. "It has been a long time," she said softly. Leonard Hale shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief himself. "Do you understand what you just did to this room?" he asked. Claire gave the faintest smile. "Sad, humble, tired." "I only sang," she answered. But everyone there knew it was far more than that. She had exposed something ugly hiding beneath the luxury and elegance of the evening. The cruelty people disguise as sophistication. The arrogance wealthy rooms often reward until true greatness enters and silences it completely. Mia stood frozen near the back of the ballroom, tears still shining in her eyes as she watched the guests who mocked Claire only minutes earlier now staring at her like she belonged on the world's greatest stages. One woman quietly set down her champagne glass and whispered, "We laughed at her." Her husband could not even answer. Ethan finally stepped forward, trying desperately to regain control. "Well," he said awkwardly, forcing out a laugh that nobody joined. "This certainly turned out differently than expected." The room remained silent. Not one person looked at him. For the first time all evening, Ethan Carlisle understood what it felt like to become invisible inside his own ballroom. Leonard Hale reached the piano slowly and looked at the leather envelope resting on top. "Your mother," he asked gently. Claire nodded. She wanted me to give this to you personally one day. Hale carefully opened the envelope with trembling hands while the room watched quietly. Inside rested a handwritten letter and an old concert photograph from nearly 15 years earlier. Claire standing beside her mother backstage after her first major performance. Young, hopeful, smiling without pain in her eyes yet. Leonard Hale read the first few lines silently before emotion overtook him completely. He closed his eyes briefly, struggling to compose himself. Then he looked back at Claire with deep sorrow and admiration. Eleanor always believed your voice was a gift the world needed, he said quietly. Claire lowered her eyes again. And standing beneath the chandeliers in the same room where she had been mocked only an hour earlier, the forgotten woman everyone underestimated suddenly became the soul of the entire evening. The ballroom remained suspended in stunned silence for several seconds after Maestro Leonard Hale spoke Claire Whitmore's name aloud. It was no longer possible for anyone in the room to pretend they had merely witnessed a pleasant surprise performance. They had publicly humiliated a woman once celebrated on some of the greatest stages in America, and now that realization hung over the Grand Carlisle Hotel heavier than the crystal chandeliers above them. Claire stood quietly beside the piano while whispers spread through the crowd like waves moving across dark water. I remember her performance in Boston. She was extraordinary. How did nobody recognize her? My God, Ethan mocked her in front of everyone. The last sentence reached Ethan Carlisle clearly. His jaw tightened. Earlier that evening, he had controlled the room effortlessly with charm, money, and social influence. But now every glance turning toward him carried something unfamiliar. Judgment. One elderly donor slowly rose from his chair near the front table and looked directly at Ethan with visible disappointment. This event was supposed to honor the arts, the man said calmly, not humiliate people. Several guests nodded quietly in agreement. Ethan forced a stiff smile. Nobody was humiliating anyone, he replied quickly. We were simply having fun. But even he could hear how weak the excuse sounded now. The room no longer belonged to him. Claire gently reached for her folded gray coat resting beside the piano, as if preparing to leave before the applause could even begin. That simple act somehow affected the crowd more deeply than any dramatic speech could have. She was not standing there demanding recognition. She was not enjoying Ethan's embarrassment. She only looked tired. Tired in the way people become after spending years carrying pain with dignity because they no longer expect kindness from the world. Mia stepped forward carefully from the edge of the ballroom, her voice shaking slightly. Miss Whitmore, she said softly. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. Claire turned toward the young waitress with gentle surprise in her eyes. Then she smiled warmly for the first time all evening. A real smile. Small but sincere. Thank you, she answered quietly. Ethan noticed how naturally the room responded to Claire now. Guests who once ignored her suddenly moved closer, hoping to speak with her. Several orchestra musicians approached respectfully. Even people with influence far greater than Ethan's now seemed more interested in the quiet woman beside the piano than in the wealthy hotel owner hosting the gala. One society columnist hurried across the ballroom, clutching her phone. Miss Whitmore, she asked breathlessly, would you consider returning to the stage publicly? Claire hesitated. Before she could answer, Maestro Hale spoke firmly. If Claire Whitmore returns to music, he said, every major concert hall in this country will open its doors for her. A hush swept through the room again. Ethan looked around helplessly as admiration continued shifting further away from him with every passing second. Earlier, guests laughed because he led them to. Now they remained silent because his approval no longer mattered. One businessman quietly approached Ethan and lowered his voice. You should apologize, he muttered. Ethan swallowed hard. Publicly apologizing meant admitting fault before the same audience that once admired him. His pride fought against it visibly, but the pressure surrounding him had become impossible to ignore. Finally, Ethan stepped toward Claire, his polished confidence reduced to awkward uncertainty. Miss Whitmore, he began carefully, if my comments earlier offended you, I apologize. The room watched closely. Claire studied him for a moment without anger, without triumph. That somehow made the moment even more painful for Ethan. You did not offend me, she said softly. You revealed yourself. The words landed harder than shouting ever could have. Several guests lowered their eyes immediately. Ethan froze completely, unable to respond. Claire then picked up the leather envelope and gently placed it into Maestro Hale's hands. "My mother always admired your music," she told him quietly. Hale nodded with emotion still visible in his face. "And she was right to believe the world needed yours." Around them, applause finally began. Slow at first, then stronger, then overwhelming. Guests rose from their seats one after another until the entire ballroom stood together beneath the golden chandeliers, clapping for the woman they once mocked beside the piano. But while the room celebrated her, Claire Whitmore never looked proud. She only looked peaceful, as though somewhere deep inside her heart, a wound she carried for years had finally begun to heal. The applause continued long after Claire Whitmore stepped away from the piano, rising through the Grand Carlisle Hotel in powerful waves that echoed against marble walls and crystal chandeliers. Guests remained standing throughout the ballroom, many clapping not only for her voice, but for the uncomfortable truth she had forced them to confront about themselves. Claire accepted none of it like a celebrity returning to reclaim lost fame. She simply stood quietly near the stage with the same calm dignity she carried when people thought she was nobody. That was the part many of them would remember most. Greatness had entered the room wearing humility instead of arrogance. Maestro Leonard Hale carefully folded Eleanor Whitmore's letter and slipped it into the inner pocket of his jacket, as though protecting something sacred. His eyes remained emotional when he looked at Claire again. "The world still remembers your voice," he said gently. Claire gave a small shake of her head. "Maybe," she answered softly. "But tonight reminded me that my mother was right about something more important." Hale waited quietly. Claire glanced across the ballroom toward the guests who once laughed at her. "People become cruel when they believe someone has nothing to offer them." The words settled heavily across the room. Several guests lowered their eyes immediately. Ethan Carlisle stood near the stage alone now, abandoned by the easy admiration that once surrounded him all evening. Earlier, he moved through the ballroom like a king among loyal followers. Now nobody seemed eager to stand beside him. Conversations no longer stopped when he spoke. Eyes no longer followed him with approval. For perhaps the first time in his carefully polished life, Ethan understood what it felt like to lose the room completely. He watched Claire quietly gather her old gray coat while wealthy donors, musicians, and journalists waited hopefully for another performance or speech. Yet Claire seemed uninterested in attention now that she finally possessed it. Mia approached carefully, holding a small white envelope with trembling hands. "Miss Whitmore," she said nervously, "I know this probably sounds silly, but I have always wanted to study music." Claire turned toward her warmly. "That does not sound silly at all." Mia looked embarrassed. "I work 2 jobs. My family cannot really afford lessons." Claire studied the young waitress for a moment, seeing something familiar inside her uncertainty. The fear of believing dreams belonged only to people born into privilege. Without hesitation, Claire reached into her coat pocket and removed a small business card from the Chicago Community Arts Foundation, where she quietly volunteered teaching music classes on weekends. She placed it gently into Mia's hand. "Come see me Saturday morning," Claire said softly. "Bring whatever music you love most." Mia stared at the card in shock. "Really?" Claire smiled. Talent should never be decided by money. Nearby, several guests overheard the exchange and looked even more ashamed than before. Because the woman they mocked all evening had shown more grace in a few quiet minutes than many of them had shown their entire lives. Snow continued falling outside as hotel staff slowly reopened the ballroom doors to the cold Chicago night. Claire slipped her coat back on and prepared to leave while applause still echoed behind her. Ethan finally stepped forward one last time, his voice lower now, stripped of performance. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "I truly am sorry." Claire paused beside the ballroom entrance and looked back at him calmly. Not with hatred, not with victory, just clarity. "Then learn from tonight," she said quietly. "Because dignity is not measured by who gets the spotlight. It is measured by how you treat people before you know who they are." Ethan stood speechless beneath the chandeliers as Claire walked away through the marble lobby toward the falling snow outside. Guests parted silently to let her pass. No cameras followed her. No reporters stopped her. And somehow that made the moment even more powerful. She had entered the Grand Carlisle Hotel as a woman everyone overlooked. She left as the one person nobody there would ever forget. Outside, The city lights shimmered softly across the snow-covered streets while Claire disappeared quietly into the Chicago winter, carrying no anger, no pride, and no need for revenge. Because sometimes the strongest people do not destroy those who humiliate them. They simply remind the world what grace looks like when dignity refuses to disappear.